Great. So now we're going to move to part 2. So in part 2 of this section, we're going to now start looking at, well, what do we do about this information? We now have a very good understanding of these 2 different worlds. We've got our survival mode world with our fast thinking, our little chimp who throws its toys and tries to stamp its little feet, and this very jungle street view, just trying to survive the moment, versus the possibility to be creative, to think things through properly, to see the higher perspective, to be able to be that generous, innovative, creative person. And in the middle, we have this button, the adrenaline button, on and off. I'm going to give, so for me, this is probably, if we talk about how do we make the world a better place, how do I change my hospital into a better place, how do I change the world into a better place? Actually, where it happens is through our interactions with people. So every interaction we have, whether we're in chimp mode or whether we are in sage mode, is going to change how the world is. It's quite scary, but that's where it's at. Even if you've decided to set up a triage system and you've printed out all the lovely SATS tools and you've got great big plans, the only way you're going to change your triage and implement triage in your rural hospital is by interacting with the nurses and to make it happen. And if you bring it on the wrong level, nothing's going to change and things are just going to, well, we've seen the ways it can go. The challenge now is now you're living in a nice rural hospital and things are not rosy, right? So there's litigation going on. There's constantly reports of collapse of our health system and things that are happening. We've got lots of doctors that are unemployed. HR, we need doctors, but there's doctors sitting at home. We've got stockouts of whether it's drugs or whether it's resources. And this is a very, very highly stressful environment to be in. And you're not going to fix it overnight. You're going to be working in a hospital where over the next 10, 20 years, every single day brings up challenges. And quite often my only solution over the last few years is just go and have a cup of tea. And that sometimes seems to be the only thing you can do. You just have to keep your head down and survive. The challenge is now is if we want to transform these environments that we are in, and if we want to survive these environments we are in, how do we do that in such stressful scenarios? Because in that, so much stress within the facility means I'm stressed, the staff stressed, the patient's stressed, and so nobody's operating at their best. And we start having these hospitals where we seem to be on these rabbit wheels of negativity and things never quite getting out of that rut. So I'm going to sort of sketch out an inner pathway, because you can't change the outer world. So what things can we do that can help us with this? What is a direction, a bit of a roadmap that I'm laying out? And step 1, which we're going to talk about first, is dual awareness. We're going to talk about how we switch to balcony view when we're in chimp view or street view. And then we're going to look at some of the advanced tools in those complex scenarios. So I want us to quickly do an exercise. It's only 90 seconds. I'm going to set my timer. And what we want to do is we're going to do, this is a mindfulness exercise, but I'm doing it not for teaching you meditation. I want you to have an experience of something. So I'm going to set my timer for 90 seconds. I'm not going to say anything. If you're watching this at a webinar on a recording, then I want you to try and do this as well. When I say start, you're going to try and clear your minds of all thoughts. So I want you to think of nothing for 90 seconds. It's not that long. So you're going to simply focus on your breath, focusing on your breathing in, breathing out. If thoughts arise, just let them go. Let me just find my timer. And then we're going to do that for the next 90 seconds. Okay, and we are starting now. Great. You can come back to yourselves again. Bring thoughts. You're now allowed to think again. You can have thoughts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a quick poll to find out how that's gone. Steph, do you have access to my poll? Why is my poll not coming up?
I've launched it.
Okay, good. Well, hopefully people can see it. Can you see the poll working?
Yeah, people are filling it in.
Right, excellent. I can't see it for some reason. So you can just give us feedback on that in a minute. So in the poll, you're going to have 5 different options. You're going to either not try the exercise at all. Haha, I know there's some of you who are just going, oh God, we'll just wait through the 90 seconds. Then if you were able to not at all clear your minds of thoughts for the whole 90 seconds, if you were able to clear it for some of the time, if you were able to clear it for most of the time, or you're able to actually have a blank mind for the whole 90 seconds. We'll just see how you did with that exercise. Steph, how's it looking in terms of, you'll just have to let me know. For some reason, I can't see it.
We've got 85% have finished the poll.
Okay, great. Maybe just give us, you can launch.
Everybody has tried it.
Good. Well done.
Okay, so and everybody had some success. So 70% were able to clear for some of the time.
Excellent.
27% were able to clear for most of the time. Excellent. And 3% were able to clear for all of the time.
Right. Wow. Well done for the 3%. Excellent. So thank you very much, Steph. So what I want to do with this is not for you to have an experience of what it's like to do a mindfulness exercise, but for you to become aware of this thing that we are calling dual awareness. When you were doing that exercise, you will have noticed that thoughts are coming up unbidden, whether you like it or not. And then there's a part of yourself that notices when the thoughts come up and trying to get yourself to not think. When you are doing that, you're actually activating 2 different parts of your brain. So one part of us is that chatter of the chimp. There's always thoughts arising constantly. When we look at the world, we have comments and ideas and thoughts and reactions that's there all the time. And then there's a part of yourself that's able to observe that. And that's a human quality. So the animal kingdom can't do that. They just live within the world of sense impressions. They don't have a thought about, oh, now why did I think that? Or why on earth did I do that? But as human beings, we have the ability to have this dual awareness. And the more you're able to observe what you are thinking and feeling, the more you are able to create this, what I call balcony view. So the only thing you have to learn, as I've said earlier, is when you're going through your life, is being able to recognize at any moment in time, especially when the chips are down, right now, am I in balcony view or am I in street view? Am I still fighting baddies? Am I all tense? Am I doing all of those defense mechanisms? Or am I able to actually get a broader picture of what's going on? If you're finding a person challenging, so if you're in a conversation, especially when you're busy fighting with your partner or having an argument with a patient or having an argument with a staff member, just being able to become aware of the fact that, okay, either me or she or both of us right now are very stressed. That in itself is very powerful, because that gives you suddenly the possibility to not get trapped into the survival mode and just think this is all it is and react only on that. And it's important to realize at that moment is you cannot arm wrestle a chimp. If you've got a nurse sitting in that room feeling defensive, at that moment, you can try and take her on and you can try and decide, right, now we're going to Barney. The other favorite one is those, those medical officers you call the regional hospital when you're trying to admit your patient. And the patient, no, they're not having it. Oh, you need to go and do this first. You need to go and do that first. And you're having that, you can feel your own adrenaline rising and you can hear the other person, their own adrenaline rising, realizing taking them on in chimp mode actually never works. It just sabotages things. It just makes things worse because you're not actually at your brightest at this point in time and you're not at your most creative in that conversation. Your next step is to decide whether you can try and switch to balcony view yourself. There are times when you have to just go, okay, right now, I need to just give it an out. Like with that nurse where I had to actually leave, I realized I was too freaked out. And I had to be able to say to the nurse, I'll come and speak to you later. Very sorry, or whatever, create some sort of opening for later. And sometimes you just have to go right now. I cannot get to balcony view. My adrenaline levels are just way too high. But if you want to try and switch to balcony level, there are different ways of doing it. So this is, of course, the cycle that you tell your patients about all the time when you're teaching them about panic attacks, right? So there's a threat, something that they feel worried about. This triggers the survival brain, which is going to go to your adrenal glands and makes lots of adrenaline. This creates your fight-flight system to come into play. So now your muscles are tense, your blood pressure is up, and this creates all these negative thoughts. So you're starting to look for all other dangers. And of course, all those other dangers that you're worrying about, it's like the guy who thinks he now is having a heart attack because he's got palpitations, creates more threat, which creates more survival brain, and suddenly you're in that little loop, right? So I quite like the Buddha's example of, he talks about the 2 arrows. So the first arrow is the thing that makes you feel unsafe. So you're in an interaction, something happens, and that makes you feel stressed. This changes your physiology. Remember, your body now goes tense, which gives feedback that there is actually a threat. And then you have these thoughts. That's what happens when you're lying in bed at night, when you're thinking, why did he do that? Or why did he say that? Or that was so ridiculous, or that is so unfair, or that should not be happening to me. And all of that you're thinking about the thing that happened is the second arrow. And sometimes the second arrow is more deadly than the first arrow and actually causes you more pain and stress than the first arrow. So to be able to deal, and this is, you know this, but we don't do this. There's 2 things you can try and do, 2 groups of things you can try and do to try and break the cycle. And what you're trying to do is you can't, if you can remove the threat, obviously try and remove the threat. But most of the time, what you're trying to do is you're trying to break this adrenaline cycle of the feedback. So the person got a fright or was in conflict or something happened that upset them. And now they're in the loop. And how do you break the loop? The one way of breaking the loop is to actually affect the physiological feedback system. So when we're talking about relaxing, it's not just about, oh, just calm down and just relax, baby. It's all about physically relaxing the muscular system to be able to send a message to your survival system, to your limbic system that, oh, there is no more threat, things are fine. And because you've broken that cycle, suddenly the body's able to reduce the amount of adrenaline and you might be able to start getting out of that cycle. The other way of doing it is actually trying to interrupt this vicious cycle of thoughts. So the thoughts you are having about why this should not have happened and why you're doing this to me, and being able to quiet your mind down is quite an important part of then also reducing the amount of threat and breaking the cycle. So to summarize in a different way, to get from stress mode to creative mode, you actually want to reduce your adrenaline production. This is a physiological activity. And I think that's one of the challenges with all the drugs that we have, because all the medicines we have for anxiety are things like benzos, which are just whiskey in a prescription form, where you're giving somebody something that temporarily breaks the cycle and sort of dulls everything down a little bit. But it doesn't actually solve the problem. And of course, it has all its addiction possibilities. So what we ideally should be doing is we should be teaching our patients how to interrupt the feedback cycle through relaxation. And that you have to actively learn how to do before you ever get to the panic attack, or before you ever get to a scenario where you're in a scenario with a loved one or a colleague or a patient, and you're feeling the stress building. How do you physically relax your body to be able to try and bring your adrenaline levels down? And then secondly, learning how to quiet these thoughts, how to break this pattern. There's lots of ways of doing that. So mindfulness is the current hot topic, or the hot thing on the press, in terms of being able to focus so much on the present that you try and block the thoughts from the past and block all the worries about the future and simply focus on the present time. One can use prayer, one can use meditation, and there's lots of activities. Or how do I, for the moment, try and focus on the present and get out of that rat race of negative thoughts that's driving the cycle? This I would like you to go and look up on your own. This is the kind of things you guys know already. And it's a little bit how to start being able to recognize when you're in adrenaline mode, being able to think about, okay, if I need to get out of adrenaline mode, what can I do right now? I want to teach you an exercise. So this is an exercise actually that I've always used with my kids, and it's a mindfulness exercise for when they're stressed and freaked out and things like that. And then I started using it on patients, just because you get a patient who comes in and it takes us 2 to 3 months. We've got psychologists, CMH, which is very cool. You might not even have that. And I want to teach them an exercise they can use for when they're feeling very stressed or anxious. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1. And the idea is that you try and do an exercise that brings you right into the present time. I'm not going to do it here. You can do it on a webinar setting. But it's quite easy to practice tonight when you're lying in bed. And if you're feeling a little bit stressed, you can do the 5-4-3-2-1. Teach it to your kids, teach it to your patients, teach it to your staff. So what we're doing is we're using our sense organization to look at things and to describe them very briefly. You will go and say, okay, I'm going to describe 5 different things that I can see. So I had a patient the other day who was having quite a bad tremor from anxiety, and we did that. And she would go, well, I see the table, and I can see the oxygen plug on the wall, and I can see, so we do 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear. So where I'm sitting here, I can hear the rain at the moment. You can hear people maybe talking in the background. You might be able to hear your own breathing. And I always do this with patients. It goes very quickly. And it's always amazing to suddenly become aware of your environment and try and find all those different streams of sound out there. 3 things you can touch. So remember, you're always sitting on a seat. You always have clothes on, you can touch. Shahzad has got a lovely exercise where he calls it a PQ, a positive intelligence exercise, where you rub together your forefinger and your thumb until you can actually feel your fingerprint. You can actually feel those grooves. And that's something you can do in any scenario. If you're sitting in a meeting and you're feeling a little bit tizzy and you want to focus on something, get your brain to quiet down, you focus just on the touch of your fingers. 2 things you can smell. There might be a smell in the air. We quite often have our mask. You can smell back of your mask. Smell your hand, smell an object that's around you. And then lastly, 1 thing you can taste. So if you actually have something you can put in your mouth, great, but you can even taste a finger or just feel what the taste in your mouth is like. So what happens when you do this exercise is that while you are focusing on these things, you are not thinking about other things. And that in itself gives your body a moment chance to just reduce that adrenaline a little bit and give you the possibility to maybe step out of that vicious cycle. But now we get to the more advanced tools. So you've managed to find out, oh my God, I'm in chimp mode. I need to get into balcony mode. I need to get out of street view, do my 5-4-3-2-1, or I do a little quick exercise just to breathe. And now what do I do? Because the patient still, or the nurse or whatever is still sitting in front of me and I have to deal with this situation. And the chimp wants the magic words. What can I say? What can I do that's going to solve this? But the reality, of course, is that every situation is very individualized. And whatever you say, it's, you know, when we did our chimp little reactions to our patients, we all know how those conversations are going to go, right? They only go one way. But as soon as you bring a more creative, innovative approach to a patient, it's amazing how many different ways it can go, because it now depends on where that patient is at. I had a patient the other day who's been on clonazepam for the last year from his private doctor as well. And we had to start having a conversation about getting him off clonazepam. And then the way the conversation went, he was actually very keen to come off the clonazepam, but very frightened to do so. So you never know, your patient might already be ready to have that conversation if you bring it in the right way. And so the conversation might change as you go on. What I have seen from doctors is that doctors are obviously highly intelligent people, otherwise you wouldn't have gotten through medical school. You are all compassionate. That is why you are in medicine. And you are actually already quite amazingly able to problem solve. That is part of your skill of being a doctor. If a doctor, all of you, guaranteed, if you are in balcony mode, you are able to come up with extraordinary ways to deal with any of those situations. It's possible. The only reason why we manage things so badly half the time is because we're stressed and stupid. But if we're actually able to access those higher skills, you don't need to go on lots of very fancy trainings to figure out what the right thing is to say. There's a few basic principles which feels natural when you are in balcony mode. And your superpower, the thing that happens automatically when you are in balcony mode and you're able to see the perspective of what's happening, is compassion. And you can feel your compassion flowing when you come in balcony mode. As a matter of fact, that's the way you know you're in balcony mode. Because if you look at that person, your patient sitting there wanting their drugs, or the nurse sitting there not wanting to come and put up the drip, or your partner leaving, and you suddenly understand that that person is a little bit freaked out, is stressed, is in chimp mode, and you can suddenly just see a little bit, have a glimpse of their pain in that moment, and you can feel your compassion lightening. It means you're now on a different level, and you're suddenly able to access innovative and creative ways of managing things that you never even would have imagined. Of course, there are some specific skills you can actually train in and learn and perfect over the years that you can use when you're in balcony mode. And the basic assumption is the easiest. The basic thing you need to do is the simplest. You've got to accept the chimp. As soon as you attack the chimp or attack the behavior or try and fix or get rid of it, that's when you're getting into your chimp war. Being generous in your assumptions of that person. This person's not always like this. This is not who this person is. This person is going through some stuff at the moment, and accepting the fact that the chimp is allowed to be there. They're allowed to be stressed. They're allowed to be in that state, and having compassion for that is extraordinarily powerful already in your consultation. The biggest skill you need to learn, and there's actually lots of good TED Talks on that, is active listening. And what you're doing at this point is, instead of doing all the talking, you're trying to figure out what's the safety issue. What is going on for this person? Now, active listening is not interrogating, because interrogating is not listening. Active listening is being able to really hear what's going on for somebody and being able to ask generative, positive, open questions. And then if you want to look at how you would phrase questions like that, so you quite like working from balcony view, but you want to sharpen up your skill set, go and look up appreciative inquiry. I've got a book recommendation at the end, or look up motivational interviewing. They are all techniques that are based on a balcony view perspective. They're all based on being able to look at how do we build safety, how do we generate positivity, how do we all build towards a balcony view and get out of the survival mode that we're in. And I used to run adolescent clinics when I was working in England, and we had these big posters on the wall, here to listen, not to talk. And creating that as a culture in your consultations, especially when the conversations are difficult, is very powerful in changing things around. And surprisingly enough, it sometimes takes less time than deciding to do the whole lecture and getting into the rabbit hole of an argument with your patient. So look, this is like a movie, right? That's always the message. Isn't that always like the message at the end of any good movie? It's always fear versus love. Fear leads to the dark side. And we need to use love, our prefrontal cortex, our acceptance and our compassion, if we actually want to create a better world. So if we go back to our 4 scenarios, and we're not going to go with them in detail, because each of those scenarios will be very different once you start in balcony view. But you can imagine when you've got people who are manipulating you, if you're able to listen and hear what the safety issues are and what the real needs are behind that, you're already a long way down the line. This doesn't mean that you're always going to do what they want trying to get you to do, because balcony view will know that it's not always the best thing to give an addict their drugs, for example. You might not always do what they like, and you might not always create a situation where they're going to walk out happy. So this is not about how to magically transform people from chimps into sages, but you can make things not worse and create a possibility that that person will come back to you. Patients who don't engage, so that's the scenario that I skipped, which is a little boy with ARVs who's not talking. On ARVs, who's just shut down, you know, your teenagers. Again, if you create active listening and actively building relationship, that creates a whole different thing than lecturing or giving them lots of instructions. For team members who don't cooperate, quite often we feel like we want to pick up the fight in the moment, but of course you might win the fight in the moment, but lose the relationship in the end. So being able to create that possibility of being able to look at how do I manage the situation now, that creates a possibility that maybe next time she will be helping with the drip, even if she's not going to help today. And then most importantly, how do we make sure that conflicts with our loved ones don't end up running out of control? I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's just to show that principle of fear versus love. Imagine if we start thinking about substance abuse. So these are all people who are using substances to reduce their feelings of anxiety, and how do we create services that make them feel safe? How do we do lifestyle interventions in terms of talking about exercise, diet, stopping smoking, all of those things in terms of how do we engage this higher part of ourselves, positive safety. And sex, how do we talk about sex that's not fear-based, but can actually work more from this acceptance and this loving space? There was a couple of questions about children. Shall I cover this or not? I'm looking at time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep going. I understand if some of you need to step out, this will all be recorded. But I've got a couple of slides that look specifically on the development of how the chimp and the sage develops over the first 20 years of life, which becomes important when we work with the different age groups. So if you look at the neurological development, obviously when babies are born, they are only in survival mode. And even that mode is not very well developed. So they only know what needs they are, but they're not able to address their own safety needs in the first 3 years. And then at about age 3, they start having the first prefrontal cortex activity. So for the first time, there's the ability to be able to better articulate what those needs might be. And you notice when that comes into play, the prefrontal brain comes into play when the child starts saying I to themselves. So when they start not saying, Johnny wants a cookie, but I want a cookie, then okay, a little bit of prefrontal activity is kicking in. But there's not yet any conscience, there's not yet any morality in the young child. They still think very much in black and white, and there's no higher prefrontal cortex to call on. There's nothing there to try and explain things to. And we work still very much through just rules. This is what right, this is what wrong, this is how we do things, this is how we don't do things. It's only like about age of 9 where the child starts having an ability for that prefrontal cortex is starting to myelinize, it's starting to mature. And now the child is able to have some control and some conscience and some moral feeling about what is wrong and what is not wrong. So if you've got a 5 or a 6-year-old doing long speeches to the 5 or 6-year-old about why they shouldn't do things and explaining and trying to call on their higher self is usually just an exhausting activity and just makes a child feel anxious. But after 9 and 10, one can start having a discussion about why things might be right or wrong. And at this age, quite often you'll notice that it's coming into play when children start asking questions about death. They start worrying about who am I? Are my parents really my parents? You get all kinds of interesting things. And kids quite often in about grade 3 goes through a little bit of a psychological crisis as that prefrontal cortex start asking questions about meaning and purpose and who am I in the world. By age 14, your endocrine system is fully into play and the chimp is fully grown. So this is of course, my lovely Great Dane here is a lovely picture of the chimp. And you can see here at age 14, the prefrontal cortex is not yet myelinized. It's starting to be active. There's still a certain amount of activity here. But as you can see here, it's still a baby and it's still not even properly matured yet. And therefore, the adolescent still primarily lives within chimp world. So if you want to understand chimp world, you look at teenagers, aren't they wonderful? But they live very much in the present. They live very much in what they feel and what they don't feel like. And they've got very little context and perspective in the future. So it's interestingly, when we look about disclosure, for example, for HIV, we normally will talk about disclosure after they're 9 years old, because for the first time, they're now able to start being able to keep a secret. They start being able to understand a little bit of what is happening, but they're not really able to take on their own treatment yet until they're over 14 years of age. This is the interesting bit. The final maturation of that prefrontal cortex only happens around age 21 to about 23 in some of the studies. So only then is the stage really active and can you really have a possibility of being what we would call a mature adult. And that's the challenge when we're dealing with that 16 to 24-year-old age group. And where you have your challenges with risk behavior and children live very much, the chimp world can be quite destructive and not yet having much power to control that. So when we were managing kids, and this is just one little slide in terms of when we talk about parenting, if you want to talk to parenting about with your patients, I quite often do this when I talk in the schools. The most important aspect of parenting children, if you want to create relatively healthy children, is safety. So children don't develop well if they got too much chimp activation as they're growing up. So all 3 levels of safety is important. But of course, in the child under 7, the primary thing is the child must feel physically safe. They must have enough food. They must feel safe and secure. They must feel that they are bodily not going to be harmed. In the middle years and the teenage years, emotional safety, peer safety, the child needs to feel included and needs to feel loved. absolutely essential, again, for all 3 ages, but this develops very strongly during this time. And then in the teenage child, this ability to say, this is who I am, this is how I experience myself, this is my identity, that becomes very important, that they must have safety and freedom in that between the ages of 14 and 21. This does not mean we obviously don't bring boundaries. It does not mean that we don't obviously discuss what is important in terms of our households or school or all of those conversations, but we always need to do it within a realm of safety. And the simple thing is if you parent from a balcony point of view, when you're having important conversations, you will be able to do this. You will make a child feel safe and loved, even when you're bringing boundaries. If you are coming from a chimp point of view, when you are fearful for your children and you're acting out of one of those 9 methods, manipulating, criticizing, fighting, pleasing, poor me, all of those things, that's when children feel unsafe. And that's when you get this vicious cycle also building of their own chimps becoming overactive. Let's not walk too much about the macro view. I could have a very quick slide in terms of, if you look at it over time, therefore, in terms of human evolution, we are better off than we used to be. But of course, originally 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we lived primarily from our survival brains. At the moment, as a society, we are trying to move more and more towards leading from the prefrontal cortex, but we're not there yet, but we're better than we were. So 200 years ago, we were still slavery. There were still mostly dictatorships and emperors. We were still, women didn't have voting rights. We still had all our isms and phobias, and the world is moving on, but we still have a long way to go. And we can see that in politics. We can see how fear affected our global COVID pandemic response. We can see what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment and what happens when politics is still within jungle politics and has not yet moved to a higher politics. And the same in the world of religion. So the religions are also slowly changing. You can look at religions 2,000, 3,000 years ago. If you look at the Old Testament, primarily fear-based. If you look at the New Testament, that lovely picture on the Mount preaching love, where we have the balcony view. So as an aside on this topic, please don't make any important decisions. Don't have any significant conversations or post anything on social media when you're in chimp mode. So it's your first step is just going to become aware of not doing stupid stuff when you're in chimp mode before you try and control the chimp. And then slowly we can try, and as adults mature and being able to actually do more and more things from a balcony view. My last couple of slides. To be able to thrive as a doctor in a rural health facility, you need to be able to live most of your day in creative mode rather than in survival mode. And if you're feeling like you're burning out, if you're feeling like you're not managing, if you look back at your day, you will find that a significant part of your day, you're actually in survival mode. And this is also from the positive intelligence. They've done research looking at people who are thriving versus people who are just surviving. And there's a ratio of 3 to 1. That negative chimp energy is very powerful and very negative. And we need at least a 3 to 1 ratio of creative times in our day versus stress times in our day to feel like we are managing and thriving. And being first creating awareness and then starting to look at, well, what is it that builds these pressures and stresses, and how do I find a way to be able to switch to balcony view more often in my day? In conclusion, bit of a marathon run. When you're in an argument with a partner or a child or a parent, when it feels as if a friend or a colleague is treating you unfairly, when you're frustrated with your patient or everything seems to be going wrong, take a deep breath, dual awareness. If you can, step onto the balcony, recognize the chimp, and find that compassion and generosity and assumptions in that moment, not only for the people that surround you, but most of all for yourself. And somehow we can together start changing and building a better world. I am so sorry that I've gone over time. It will be recorded as 2 different presentations. So actually it probably should be 2 different sets of presentations. These are some of my favorite references, all drawn on from this book. And if you want to go and study these things further, The only one I haven't mentioned is this Conversations Worth Having. It's a great book about appreciative inquiry, and it's a lovely book in terms of communication styles. Wherever you go, there you are. It's a great book about mindfulness for those of you who want to look into that a little bit further. I would love any comments, or if anybody's got comments or questions, you're very welcome to put those in the chat. Steph, if you could run the poll for us, that would be great. And that's just for us to get a little bit of feedback on how useful you found the session, and the quality of the session. But any comments in the chat also is very welcome. We're going to
Madeleine, I could only see the dual awareness poll. I can't see another poll.
No.
Oh, yes, now I can. Now I can. Sorry.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking the chat if there's any comments. So these will be recorded, and I'm going to be able to make them available on YouTube. And I'm very keen for us to train more and more of our staff and our patients and our communities around us about basically understanding their neurophysiology. For me, this kinds of conversations should be part of schooling. Great, and I've got some comments here. So personally, I can do the listening and compassionate thing twice, maybe even 3 times, but I get frustrated having to repeat myself and feel that I'm not a psychologist. And eventually I get stressed out because I want to avoid the patient in the long run. Excellent. So it's a very good example of what happens daily to us when we are sitting in with the patients. And again, you can't every single time do the right thing. Sometimes you just have to go, I can't manage this right now because I'm way too stressed and I am way too tired. And just knowing that makes you a little bit more compassionate for yourself, that you're not a bad doctor and you're not a bad person, you're just having a bad moment. And being able to look at how do you, maybe next time you can do it slightly differently. I find the most important place to practice this is with our loved ones, with our kids, with our relationships. I've had to learn all of this the hard way, as we all do, having to try and manage challenges and manage things better. And I wished I'd had some of that information earlier, because we sometimes have to get things very wrong before we learn how to get things right. Steph, I don't know if we don't need to give a lot of feedback on the poll now. I just want to hear if most people have answered.
Yeah, everybody has answered. Can you not see it? Because I'm sharing it.
I know it's supposed to be launched. I don't know. The mysteries of Zoom, it doesn't really matter. Okay. We'll be able to go through that later.
Yeah, so everybody who's still online has filled it in.
Okay, thank you.
And 79% found it very useful.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Great, everybody. I think that we're going to stop now. You guys need to get back to your families. Your chimps are needing food and rest and relaxation. And please do share these presentations when I send them round to anybody who you think might benefit from them. They're not only for doctors. For Wednesday night. So this was now just dealing with people where we're still able to have some prefrontal activity. Sometimes patients have got no access to prefrontal activity. So your psychotic patient is only in chimp mode. Your patient who is under severe substance abuse is only in chimp mode. Your patient who's having a severe panic attack or stress is only in chimp mode. And sometimes you're not able to deal with those patients by coming with some great balcony view perspective. So on Wednesday night, we're going to have Prof. Leslie Robertson coming to talk to us about the aggressive patient. We'll obviously looking at things like sedation as well, but some of the practicalities of the 72-hour admission in a rural health setting, when you actually have to look at some chimp mechanisms to deal with somebody that you cannot simply talk around. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you Wednesday night.